Hi, I'm Lilia Lewis. Welcome to another edition of Building a Better You. Now we're going to stay in the book of Daniel that we started in last week. Last week we covered chapters 1 and 2, and we're going to kind of go over that first, just to give you a refresher, and then we'll get into today's chapter, which is chapter 3, and that will tell us about the fiery furnace and how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego happened to get into that situation. But I want to kind of go back and refresh what we spoke about last week because we were just learning about them. And remember, King Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of Babylon, and he took over their country, the country of Judah where they lived. So that meant all the people of Judah became captives under King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Daniel and his friends were among the captives. But at that time, they, of course, they were the Jewish faith, so they were sticking to their own faith and their own beliefs, believing that no matter what happened going forward, that God would take care of them and deliver them. Now, the king wanted his men to go through all the young people at that time, I guess like teenagers and up, because he wanted all the young people that were of status from Judah. So that might be sons of the king or prince or, any governor or any high person of status, because their children were, of course, they considered well bred and they had good education, because the king had a purpose for selecting just the higher echelon children, because he wanted to teach them and train them the way he wanted them to be as Babylonians. And that's where Daniel and his three friends came into play, because they were of that upper echelon. And once they became captives under the Babylonians, they changed their names. Because if you remember Daniel's name, they changed it to Belshazzar. And then Hananiah, he became Shadrach. And Mishael, he became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. And they changed their names because they wanted them to adopt the Babylonian way. And the king wanted all the finest children because he thought he could train them, because they were already educated, and now he could train them the way he wanted them to be trained and become teachers of the Chaldean language. And those were the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel and his friends were among those that were selected. So now the king, once he had them selected, he gave them certain food. He gave them all the same meat that he ate and all the wine that he drank, because he wanted to nourish them and keep them strong and healthy. But Daniel and his friends were not of that faith. They didn't eat meat. And Daniel went to the guard and he asked him, he said, "Can we have just pulse to eat?" And I told you last week, pulse is seed from peas and beans and lentils. So it was almost like asking for a vegetarian type diet. And just give us water. We don't need wine to drink. But the guard, he was a little reluctant, because he was thinking, well, what happens if I do that and then you don't look nourished like the other children? When the king sees you, he's going to have my head. So Daniel persuaded him. He said, "I'll tell you what. Just give me 10 days. Give us the pulse and the water. Continue feeding them. And then look at us and see. See what happens. How do we look compared to them?" And as the text said in chapter 15, back when we read that in chapter 1, verse 15, it said after the 10 days that Daniel and his friends looked healthier and stronger, and they had even gained weight. They were even fatter than the children that ate the king's food. So, of course, after that, when the king saw that, he put all the children on the pulse and the water. But later on, don't forget, the king invited Daniel and all his magicians and all them to meet with him. And the king was asking them questions, and they were answering far better than his magicians, and far better than the astrologers, even better than the Chaldeans, the wise men. And the king noticed this, and the king selected them because he said, these four are 10 times better than all my magicians and all my Chaldeans. So they got to stand with the king. But God had given them, Daniel and his friends, he had given them the knowledge. He had given them wisdom. He had given them skill. And he had given Daniel the understanding in all visions and dreams. Because what they never deviated from their faith in their God. They didn't eat the food they weren't supposed to, and they knew that their God was going to bring them through. That's the kind of faith we call unshakable faith. And as we went on in chapter 2, we said King Nebuchadnezzar, he was having these dreams, and his dream kept reoccurring, and he couldn't figure it out, and he called his magicians and all his Chaldeans to before him, and he's telling them, I need to know what this dream means. Well, they're saying, okay, well, tell us the dream. But then he realized, I don't remember. I don't remember the dream. And they're telling him, well, oh, king, how can we interpret the dream if you can't tell us the dream? And he says, well, you're the magicians, you're the sorcerers, you're supposed to be able to do anything. Bring it back to me. Now the king wants them to bring his dream back to his mind. So that goes back and forth. And they're trying to make him understand we can't do that. That can only be done through the gods. And our gods are not of flesh. So that means that's just telling the king, well, we're just men too, and we can't read your mind. Well, that's not what the king wanted to hear. So he was furious with them because they couldn't bring his dream back. So he says, well, what good are you? And then he just declared that they all had to die. They all had to be put to death. Well, Daniel and his friends are part of the Chaldeans because they're considered wise men as well. So that made Daniel ask the guard. He said, well, let me go before the king. Let me talk with the king. So Daniel went before the king, and Daniel said, well, O king, if you just give me a little time, I'll be able to tell you what your dream was, and I'll be able to interpret it for you. So the king agreed because he was desperate to know what his dream was. So Daniel went home and told his friends, he told them what he did. He said, I told the king that I would, tell him what his dream was and give him the interpretation of his dream. He said, but what I need for you guys to do is start praying. Just start praying. He wanted them to just pray for them to get what they needed out of that. Pray for God's guidance. So at that point, Daniel, they all went to sleep, and they all prayed. They prayed for understanding and mercy, and they wanted to know the secret. And the secret was the king's dream. And as it said, I think it was in verse 19, it says, while Daniel was sleeping, the secret was revealed to him in a night vision. So that again says they never lost faith in what was in front of them, they still was trusting in God to deliver them and give them what they needed. They never lost their faith at any time. They always trusted in God. And they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that He would see them through. So after Daniel had the dream, he went to the king and he said to the king, I have found what your dream was. And the king was so pleased that he fell on his face and worshiped Daniel. And the king even said, your God is God of all gods. He is the Lord of all kings. He is the revealer of secrets. And he just worshiped Daniel. And he said in verse 17 how wonderful his God was. And he made Daniel the ruler over Babylon and over all the wise men. And his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And that just goes to show, once you believe and have unshakable faith in our God, just like it worked for them, it could work for you. The instance may be different, but the solution is always the same. So now that brings us to today's lesson, which is still in the book of Daniel, but it's chapter 3. And now we're going to learn about the fiery furnace and how it even came to be. So we're going to look at chapter 3, and we're going to start in verse 1. And I'm going to kind of skip around and try to keep the story consistent. But the bottom line is still the same thing: having faith in God. So the first thing I want to say is the very first verse of chapter 3 says, the king made an image of gold. First of all, if you did all that glorification earlier, previously, why now does he still want to make an image? Does he still not believe that our God, just because he's not visible, does he need something to see to believe? So let's go forward. And look how big it was. Its height was 80 cubits, and the breadth of it was 6 cubits. Now that means cubits is 18 inches. So that means you're telling me it's 6 feet wide and 90 feet high? That's humongous. But you see, they had the slaves back then building these humongous images to themselves. But then let's go further. He had it set up right in the plain of Dura, which is in the middle of the province of Babylon. So then King Nebuchadnezzar, he gathered all his governors and told all the higher people, the princes, the captains, the judges, all the counselors, all the rulers of all the provinces, that they had to come to a dedication of this image. So they went back, each of those in charge went back and told the people, you have to come to this dedication. So let's go to verse 4, because verse 4 tells about how this happened. So the herald cried, that's the one who, the town crier, so to speak. Now he's making this big announcement, and he's saying, in verse 4, he's saying out loud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. That means everybody. Everybody under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar. Doesn't matter what your language is, what your province is. all you people, as soon as you hear the sound of cornets, flutes, harps, all music of all kinds, you must fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And if you don't fall down to worship, you shall be put in the midst of the fiery furnace. How about that? So therefore, of course, when the people heard the music, they knew they didn't have a choice. So they did. When they heard it, when the time came, they fell down and worshiped the golden image. But let's look at verse 8. It says, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. Now that means that certain wise men, they noticed that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down at that time. Now they remembered that the king had said everybody should fall down and bow before the image. So now they're saying that, well, they're not bowing down. So you know what they did? They went back to the king. The Chaldeans that saw that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not fall down and worship, they went back to the king. And they told the king, let's go up to verse 12. And they said to the king, there are certain Jews who thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Now remember, they were assigned over the affairs of Babylon. And they named them. They said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor do they worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Well, you know that made the king furious because he wanted everybody. There were no exclusions. So at this point now, he's full of rage. And he said to them, bring them to me. Bring them before me. And they did. They brought them before him. And let's go to verse 14. And verse 14 says, Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, and he said to them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the music, if you fall down and worship the image, well, then everything will be fine. But if you worship not the image, you shall be cast into the fiery furnace in that same hour. And then who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Well, let's look at Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego's answer. His question was, who is your God? Now, where is he going to be that shall deliver you out of my hands? And they answered him. They answered him and they said, let's look at verse 16. What they say? O king, we are not careful to answer to thee in this matter. That means we're not going to skirt around the answer. We're going to tell you the truth. And the truth is, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But, now here's the but. Whether or not he delivers us, if he does not, let it be known unto you that we still will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. So they were telling him in so many words, it doesn't matter what the decision is that God makes, whatever it is, it's not going to change our faith or our belief in our God. He is our God. No matter what the situation, no matter what the circumstance, we will not be dissuaded. Not by you, O King, not by your golden image, O King. Nothing will dissuade us from believing in our God. Well, of course, once King Nebuchadnezzar heard this, now he was really furious. In fact, he was so annoyed with them at this point that his whole demeanor towards them changed. It's almost like saying he became a hater because he was so angry with their response. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than it usually is. So he was really totally and completely outdone with them. And then it says they were bound. He called his most high mighty men. Let's go to verse 20 and we'll read that. And he commanded that the most highly skilled men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. So they dressed them. They dressed them in their coats and their hats and their hosen and all their garments, and put them all into the midst of the fiery furnace. But look at verse 22. It says, because the king's commandment was so urgent and so desperate and so intense, and the furnace was so exceedingly hot, that when they went to take them up to the furnace, the flame of the fire flew out and slew the men that were taking Shadrach and Meshach into the furnace. Now right there, God was showing his ability, his competence. But it says there, and the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they fell down into the midst of the fiery furnace. But then, look at verse 24. Nebuchadnezzar rose up because he was astonished. He was dazed and shocked. And he rose up and he said unto his other counselors, didn't we cast 3 men into the midst of the fire? And they said, yes, king. And he said, but I see 4. I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. No damage was done to them. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. And Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the furnace, and he couldn't believe it. And he spoke and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, come hither. And they came out of the midst of the fire, and they all stood in awe. They all stood in awe. And Nebuchadnezzar praised, and he spoke. And he said, verse 28, he said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servant that trusted in him, and have changed even my words, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own. And therefore I make a decree that every nation, every language shall never say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. For if they do, they shall be cut into pieces, and their homes shall be made a dunghill. That's God in action. That's God of all gods. He said it before. Now he really realizes there is none that can supersede God. And once again, he promoted them over the province of Babylon. Once again, that shows unshakable faith. Once again, that lets us know if we could have half the faith that they had in God then, have it today. Because you don't know what situation God can bring you out of. Faith, trusting in God, knowing and believing that God can handle any situation, no matter what it is. Do you have that kind of faith? Do you feel like that when you're going through your trials? Do sometimes your trials feel like a fiery furnace? Don't start questioning God. You know God can only do what you allow him to do. You've got to be open to him. You've got to be willing and ready to receive him. Willing and ready to receive him. And that brings me to the poem I wanted to share with you today, and it is entitled Ready. I think of the fishermen that were on the boat. They were having such a plight. Then Jesus calmed the roaring sea as they watched that wondrous sight. He did it, oh, so easily, with hands that were so steady. They were amazed and stood in awe. For this they were not ready. Remember the lame man who couldn't walk? Jesus held out his hand so steady. He helped him up and said, "Go now." And for that, he wasn't ready. I often wonder what it would be like if Jesus came to visit me, to sit and talk and tell him my thoughts. What a glorious time that would be. Then he would extend his hands to me, those hands that were so steady, and whatever assignment he gave me to do, I'd make sure that I was ready. Are you ready? Nobody was ready to see them come out of that fire. They knew God was going to save them. They trusted him in that, but they didn't know how. And of course, King Nebuchadnezzar, he never imagined. But when he saw God overturn his word, he fell down and worshiped again. Now he knew that there was only one true God. And just like he believed, all the time we don't see what God's going to do. But we've got to learn to trust him. We've got to learn to believe him. That's why we have to read the word, study the word, and learn to understand the word so that we can learn to think and be like Jesus. Is there an assignment that maybe God's given you that maybe you're not quite sure of? Maybe you're not quite understanding or quite getting it. Don't put so much effort into trying to get it or understand it. Put your effort and your thought in knowing that God can handle it. Pray for the strength. Pray for strength and wisdom and understanding, but do it on a daily basis. Make time for your conversation with God. Make time for your prayer time. Be ready to do whatever God puts before you. He always has a plan, an assignment for our life. So I'm going to ask you, how strong is your faith? Is there a fiery furnace before you? And are you trusting God to bring you through? I am. And my closing words today are, no matter what God's decision may be, know that it's always for our best. And until next week, I'm Delia Lewis. Thanks for joining me.